Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our podcast on history, ethics, philosophy, and Red Dead Redemption 2. So this week, we are reading, for undergraduates, Olson's Red Dead History Chapters 4 through 7 is required. And for graduate students, Lewis S. Warren's Buffalo Bills America is required. You'll notice that there's no ethical theory or philosophy reading this week. We thought it might just be nice to take a little break and for you to only really have to focus on one area. So that's what we're doing. We're going to talk about those chapters a little bit. But first, since you had your Stage 1 reflection papers, we want to talk a little bit about that. So we will make sure to give you written feedback as well as a particular score on that by early to middle of next week. That's what we're going to aim for. But we've already seen some commonalities and sort of things to maybe try to avoid or adjust. And so we want to get that to you as soon as possible. That way you will keep it in mind when you're writing your first draft, your rough draft. So as a reminder, for undergraduate students, the page length is between 8 and 10 pages. And for graduate students, the page length is between 10 and 15 pages. So the most common things that we saw, and I'll kind of start with one of the things that I saw a lot of is right now, I think there's like a lot of, for lack of a better term, it's people biting off more than they can chew, or they're trying to do too much in an 8 to 10 page paper. And we just want to remind you that, this is a 8 to 10, or again, if you're a grad student, 10 to 15 page paper. And so what that means is, you don't want to you're not doing like a whole book. You're not writing a master's thesis or a dissertation or a multi-volume series. You really you only have 8 to 10 or 10 to 15 pages to really do justice to whatever set of topics you want to talk about, right? And so part of what that means is if you pick a topic that is too broad, then your treatment of it will probably be pretty poor or very shallow or something, and we don't want you to do that. And partly that's just, for our benefit. Also, it's for your own benefit. You don't want to write something that is not well done because you try to cram too much stuff in there or talk about too much stuff. So we want to encourage you to think, if my topic is really, really too broad and I can't really do justice to it, I can't do a good, detailed, serious treatment of it in 8 to 10 pages or 10 to 15 pages, then maybe we think about kind of narrowing it a little bit. And remember, your paper is really, you're going to probably spend half a page to a page on your introduction, probably spend half a page to a page on your conclusion. So that really means that you've got maybe 7 to 9 actual pages of content, and maybe, 9 to 14 actual pages of content for the grad level paper. And really, that's not that much. If you think about, your paper as having sort of 3 major sections, not just that you're doing the history, philosophy, and Red Dead, of course, those are essentially what you're doing. But if you think of them as having like sort of 3 main foci, then, well, if you're doing a 7 to 10 page or 7 to 8 to 10 page paper that you only really have 7 to 9 pages or so, or even 6 to 8, well, that means you got basically 2 pages for each section, for each thing, to really write about and go into detail and explain your sort of persuasive argument. Even if you're doing 9 to 14 or 8 to 13 pages, depending on how long your conclusion and introduction are, that's really not that much page length. That's not that much time to write about these different parts of your paper. So we just want to encourage you to be focused and make sure that whatever topic you choose, you really can do a good job treating it, incorporating resources, talking about research, giving your own view, building your argument in that pretty narrow space of those pages. So, Dan, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, and as you're, the part of the exercise of writing it out is having your thoughts in front of you so you can read your thoughts, build off your thoughts, revise your thoughts. And the outline part is to make sure that, as you're telling this story, but also addressing these, the philosophical elements or the history or the parts of the video game.
Yes.
And you have these sections that are making your argument for the overall sort of thesis of the paper. You always want to keep going back to that original thought. Yes. And because that original thought will also evolve as you're writing.
Absolutely.
Right. So the whole thing should evolve, but you also want to just keep an eye on how much time you have and how many pages you have. one topic that someone spoke of, just kind of the concept of freedom and sort of the Vanderlyn gang's sort of quest for freedom. Within history, we can kind of situate that. I think I think today is the chapter on the Jesse James. And so you could argue that a part of Jesse James, there's this idea of freedom. Again, this is sort of an American ideal, but just because, the Vanderlyn gangs, trying to get towards freedom, you could also argue that Cornwall is exercising his freedom too. So
absolutely.
A part of this is not necessarily setting up good guy, bad guy, but you're examining the complexity of the era.
Yep.
And I think that the philosophical concepts will help you navigate the complexities and contradictions of the history and the elements within the game. Because obviously in the game, you ostensibly are good people, but then you often end up doing horrible things with collateral damage to civilians.
Yes.
And so there's a lot of relativity in that. So I think that's where if we were just writing a history paper, it's easier to get stuck in sort of good guy, bad guy. But I think the philosophy allows us to create sort of a third component that really opens the door to thinking about complexity in history and contradiction in history.
Sure.
But again, map out your, how long do you have? How many pages have you written?
Yes.
Do you need to go to the next section? Right.
Yeah.
If you're 5 pages into a section, you probably need to wrap it up and get rid of a page or two because you need to make room for these other sections too. So.
And that can be really hard if what you're producing you really like and feel proud of, just save it as a separate document and then chop it down a little bit. I just recently had to do this with a paper I was writing. I was going on with it and I kind of pulled back and realized, I spent way too much time on this, but I really like what I have. So I just kept it, and then I thought the project that I'm doing, I will shorten it because that's what's required for this project. But I'll keep that other stuff because maybe it'll be useful later in another project or something. But yeah, you might have to edit it and cut. And sometimes, especially if you care about your writing and you like it, you just might be like, I'm having a hard time figuring out what to cut. Right?
Yeah. And for those who are looking to, get into sort of the pool of papers that will be selected for either us publishing something or trying to find a home for it somewhere. Keep that stuff that you cut on the plate there. It might come in handy because I think once the class is over and we've selected papers, we'll get with each one individually. We're also bringing on a third student who's soon to be grad student. Yeah, and
they'll be editing.
They'll be helping to edit, and they're quote a professional editor. That's what they do. So we'll go through the whole editing process, and you might end up bringing some of those components back. But for the class paper, you'll definitely want to adhere to the page length and just keep an eye on where you're at as you're writing.
Absolutely.
The other part too is you don't want to waste 8 hours writing something that you're only going to say, you're only going to use 3 pages, and you could have been using that time for other parts.
That's right.
Yeah. And then again, questions, email us and we can meet via Zoom.
Yes, we'd be more than happy to meet with you. I met with a student earlier this week, and I think it was helpful and productive on their part, although, I don't know, don't quote me, but it seemed like it was very helpful. And so, especially if you're just confused about how to do something, and this is especially true, if you feel like you don't understand some part of the history that you've been reading, you don't understand some part of the philosophy you've been reading, but you want to use it, please talk to us. We're here to help you, and we want to help you. So just email us. We have listed office hours, but also I think both of us are happy to, as long as we can find time in our schedule on other professional obligations and personal obligations, to just find time to talk with you and help you out with this stuff. So
yeah, I technically my office hours are whenever you can schedule Zoom. So
there you go.
I don't really have set office hours where I'm on Zoom, but if you need to get together, we can just set up a Zoom, and that's the office hours. So.
Sure. Yeah.
So for this week, we just have chapter 4 to chapter 7
of Olson. Yeah,
of Olson,
the first historian to write a book on Red Dead Redemption and history, and the first one to teach a class on it.
And the if you get the audio book, which we recently discovered a few weeks ago, but you have Arthur Morgan, the voice actor.
Yeah. Reading it to you.
Yeah, I cannot remember his name. We were playing it in class today.
That's right. Yeah.
But he actually reads the entire book, which I definitely am. I need a copy of that.
Yes, me too. Me too.
It was hard to not smile as you're listening to him read the introduction of the book.
That's right. I thought the same thing.
It's like, oh my God, we're in a game.
It's Arthur.
But it's right. So it's pretty neat. So. Thinking about cows and cowboys, again from my 19th century food consumption history, you always just take for granted everyone's been eating the way they have, and
Yep.
I didn't realize that pork was at the top of the food chain for meat, and cow or cattle, beef, whatever, that kicks in after, but. Again, shouldn't surprise us. It kicks in once you have the technology and infrastructure to create an industry that can bring the price of beef down to the point where it can be consumed by just regular people. And, a part of that are these refrigerated cars that can move beef. But the other part, too, is that, post 1850s, really the Mexican-American War, and the Native American removal from the Great Plains, the elimination of the bison, right? All that whole process opens up land for cattle. If you've ever seen the John Wayne movie Red River, I think from 1950. That's about the cattle drive from Texas up to Abilene, I want to say.
Okay.
But to work, this industry, you need cowboys.
That's right.
And so there's this, chapter on cowboys. We're technically playing cowboys, but as I want to say, the author talks about the moment when I think you and John, right? Arthur and John have to go corral sheep.
Yes.
And neither of them really know how to do it.
That's right. Yeah.
And the best part is you as the player don't know how to do it. So it's as clumsy as the actual people that are in the game.
Yeah. It's a nice parallel between the player and the character.
Yeah. And the other part too, I think there's as when you do deeper dives in the history and you get past the sort of the mythological elements, there is this sense of, the cattle industry itself is a product that is very much a part of the Gilded Age with feculation, investors, really large-scale businesses coming in. And so one of a few of the examples, the Swan Land and Cattle Company, right, who purchased 600,000 acres in Wyoming and Nebraska for $2.5 million in 1883.
Yeah.
And these were Scottish investors, right? These are, if they're not even really the bulk of it, it's not the United States.
Oh, that's awesome.
Then you have the Tenon, Texas, right, in the Texas Panhandle, a Chicago-based group called this is the best, Chicago-based group called the Capital Syndicate.
Wow.
It's perfect name, and it's backed by British investors. So it's the UK is kind of funding this expansion.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Right, and they held 3 million acres.
Capital Syndicate does sound like a dystopian faction.
Yeah, it's with in capital with an O.
Oh,
so it makes it, for some reason, the O makes it a little more aggressive,
a little more nefarious.
Yeah, like, do you know who you're messing with? I'm from the Capital Syndicate, mate.
That's right.
Right, but there are also other not so spectacularly huge companies, but there are large companies. So this is And it shouldn't surprise us because of this relationship between, federal government, railroads, railroads that are tied to Wall Street. So, if you're tied to Wall Street, you kind of know the insides of what's happening out there. So an investor group probably would have sort of, they have all this land, let's jump on it.
Yeah.
We have capital, so we can buy a bunch of the land away.
That's right. Yeah.
The other part where, the idea that, and this is sort of watching Western films, right, where it's mostly white cowboys. But for, within the history of this, a quarter were African American, and then a lot were Mexican or Mexican American, which I want to say he doesn't necessarily go into it, but I've read elsewhere where a lot of the aesthetics of being a cowboy comes from that that Southwest, that Southwest tradition of when it was Mexico, right? And you just had ranchers. You had moments when cowboys went on strikes, and of course, I guess you could see this. You could see maybe this play out in the game if it was more about cattle, but ranchers would call like the Texas Rangers to protect the cattlemen and put down the strike. So in this case, it's Texas Rangers. It's not the Pinkertons.
Yeah.
You have the Johnson County War in Wyoming, right? And that's dominated. That area was dominated by cattle barons who formed a trust called the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, less nefarious sounding than the Capital Syndicate.
Yeah.
Right. And they basically controlled the governor, made sure legislation was passed in their favor. They blacklisted cowboys who owned their own livestock. And a part of that mantra was, well, that livestock is just our stolen livestock. They couldn't possibly have bought it, through legit channels.
It's like a built-in excuse.
Yeah. Cowboys, go on strike. 1890, there's a war between cowboys and small ranchers, and they're fighting these cattle barons. And the cattle barons, who do they hire? They hire the Pinkertons to protect their interests. And then if you were to watch the movie Heaven's Gate, which I think is 1980, that film is largely sort of built around the history of the Johnson County War. The other, another chapter in here that's really interesting, and I think we were talking to the class today on campus here, and there's a podcast called The Dollop, right? They're two comedians. When one does the sort of the research history part, and then the other just kind of comes in blind and doesn't know what the topic's about. And they do I think part 1 and part 2 on the Pinkertons, which is really a fun story. In a very, I guess, fun in the history is always an absurd catastrophe. And so it's fun in that sense. But the other one is they do an entire episode on Samuel Colt.
Oh, that's good.
And so you get to kind of know the evolution of Colt.
These parts of the West,
and it's a great story because it mirrors the evolution of industrial capitals in the United States. I think people forget that firearms. There was a very much an artisanal, an artisan approach to firearms. And then Colt helps to, and he, I guess, supposedly steals ideas from Britain, which they're so much further ahead. But the idea that you bring in interchangeable parts. And then that allows, if a gun breaks in some way, you just replace the part. Or when you're constructing the gun, it's easier to put the gun together. Like it's a mass-produced
Not everything
item.
has to be one of one.
And then that, of course, makes Colt revolvers affordable. But the other part, too, is you're better off having a little revolver of bullets each time you shoot, so you're not having to either reload or mess around with putting another cartridge in. So that's I think that's an underappreciated, in my opinion, the history of the revolver itself.
Yeah.
And then this kind of expansion into the West where, I would love to see the numbers on sales. Like, were there a lot of sales? Are these weapons left over from the Civil War?
Yeah.
Right. You can never underestimate that. Like, how many X number of rifles during the Civil War? I'm sure many are broken and dismantled and thrown away, but a few have to be, sort of sent west. I could see enterprising people in the Army that do supplies, right? Like, we lost that crate of rifles. Yeah. Which I think that's one of the missions where you go and get a crate of really good rifles. Sure do. Bolt action.
Bolt actions, yeah.
Yeah. So,
and then of course you get to keep one.
And you get to keep one. Yeah, that's true. And it's all in your saddle, right? Like, that's right. 10 guns and a bow and arrow. It's right. Just nicely tucked into that saddle. In there. No biggie. On a side note, I usually have 2 guns. Yep. And so when I get off the horse and go in somewhere, Arthur has 2 guns strapped to his back. Yep. No big deal. Yeah. I'm
just a walking arsenal.
Yeah, I got my auto shotgun, and then I have my.
It's like, is this Red Dead Redemption 2 or is this the Punisher?
I know. Yeah, it's realistic. The other part too, I really appreciated the legal culture that Olson brings in.
Oh yes.
Right, this idea of kind of this evolution of to the wall self-defense. So. If you're against the wall, then you can shoot back, self-defense, and you won't be, you're not going to be charged with murder.
That's right.
No duty to retreat, right? Little more aggressive. I think you don't need the wall right behind you.
That's right.
The wall can be about 20 feet back.
That's right, yeah.
Self-defense. And then today, I think it's the stand your ground, which arguably is very slippery in the sense that
absolutely,
someone threatened me and I chased them around the block.
Yeah,
and I stood my ground.
Yeah. Well, what is the current one that's even more aggressive? Castle doctrine or something?
Oh wow!
Like your home is your castle.
Oh, okay, okay.
Invades it, you kind of do whatever you want to it or something. I don't
know. I'm
messing that up. I'm not a lawyer. So
yeah, that one. It seems like that seems more reasonable because you're already to the wall because you're in your walls, right?
For sure. Yeah.
You shouldn't have to retreat from your
home. Sure.
And I'm standing my ground. It like brings everything together.
That's right. Yeah.
In your castle. Right. The other part I think is really interesting. I thought, I read this last fall, but I guess I'd forgot about it. Yeah. Like the sectional identities. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, so you have post-Civil War, but there's this, and I guess you see that with Dutch, where he's like, my dad, he didn't die for nothing.
That's right,
right, that sort of thing. Obviously, when you're in the South, they're talking about their families and the loss in the war. But I found that really interesting.
Yeah,
but then he goes through Wild Bill Hickok, right? Was that page 63? And talking about his history, right? And if you read for this week the Warren's Buffalo Bills America, I think for the class you could get away with that, like the first half of the book.
Okay.
Right. I mean, it's the other part's interesting because you just have the evolution of this entertainment.
Sure.
And it's just like, Buffalo Bill is, he's just another character that was, he made up so much stuff. That's another, that would be a good dollop.
Yeah.
He made up he just lied about so much stuff. You could just get away with it back then.
Yeah.
I was on the Wells Fargo Pony Express.
Exactly.
And then I think his sister wrote some stuff that totally just undercut.
Yeah.
Like, no, he wasn't doing that. But again, I think there's always something interesting about, even reading made up stories, because it suggests, he heard bits and pieces of this from somewhere, and then it becomes your story.
That's right.
But he does grow up during that moment, the tension between Missouri and Kansas, or bleeding Kansas, right? And I want to say his father was a victim of that.
Okay.
And so, it'd be hard not to think that his life after that is not, marked by this sectional sort of hatred towards that Confederate, post-Confederate, sort of apologists for the South. And so there's a really neat, he goes through a few episodes here. On Vine Street, of course, in Hays, Kansas, there is a steak place, right, to bring all of this back together.
That's right.
There's a steak place called Hickok's, right? And it's good, right? It's. I mean, when you get a steak out, it's always going to be expensive. I think it's. I think it's something you do when someone else is paying.
Yeah. And they've definitely made it like it's kind of Western-y.
Yes.
The Indian side setting is kind of Western oriented.
It's pretty good food. So if you're in Hays, go to Hickok's.
Yeah, there you go. That's right.
Right, they're paying us for this podcast.
That's right. This podcast brought to you by Hickok's.
By Hickok's. But that next part, no free ads. But for the next part, right, with the Jesse James, again, until I started reading about in-depth 19th century, Jesse James was just a name from Old West, kind of cliche. But, right, they're part of that sort of peripheral Missouri Confederate guerrilla group. And this is really interesting. I've grown to be fascinated with the evolution of when there's wars, and then what do you do after the war?
That's right. Yeah.
Right. So you think about
the war do when things are at peace and you got to come home and adjust to a totally different way.
Yeah, but you have especially if you have a good skill set.
Yeah. Right.
You're good at doing war. So what do you do? And it's I don't know enough. I'd have to do some research, but I always think of in parts of Latin America where there is very much like Cold War guerrilla insurgencies, and so you have these professional armies versus guerrilla groups, but it lasts decades. And then when there's a truce, what do you do? And I mean, who would be hiring that skill set? And we always think they're cocaine sellers. So when you think of cartels, it's like, I mean, what percentage?
Like Blackwater, like professional.
Or you go into the big. I think that's like the big time, right? Like it's large six-figure salary for contracting work. But it's I always when we think of war, it's like eventually things have to shut down, and how do you weave people back into a society that usually is pretty shallow? I mean, that's I didn't serve, and I didn't serve in a war or anything, but I think there's that scene in Hurt Locker that seems to resonate, where he's he was in Iraq, and then all of a sudden he's in this grocery store aisle. And this kind of this surreal, what is this?
My father was in Vietnam, but just sort of right at the end. I had an uncle that was in it for a little longer, and my uncle had pretty significant issues getting back. My grandfather served in the Korean War, which I think people talk about as the forgotten war, because nobody thinks about that. They think about Vietnam and World War II and stuff. And several of my close friends of mine have served in, I guess the second Iraq-Afghanistan war. And that is a big adjustment. And some of them, I mean, I'm thinking of one guy in particular that spent at least, years after that doing independent contractor work before he decided to finally try something else. But
and
so it's I got all these skills. I can do this. I'm used to it. I'm good at it. what am I going to be, a grocery bagger or whatever it is, right? Like, yeah.
Or just I always
go
think
to a college class and listen to some liberal hippie lecture me or whatever, like that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
I always think too, because there's a certain set. It's the code. Like there's organizations like that. There's a code. So it's like, what happens when you come back and it's, dog eat dog, fake, grossly materialistic, complaining about the worst. Yeah,
someone
ruined my frappuccino. The foam isn't quite there, and it's just like, how do you even? How would you deal with that if And then when you say Korea. Yeah. Side note, if you're wanting to watch an amazing documentary that, again, as you've probably heard me say, where's the movie? Like a new movie. I think it's called Chosen Reservoir.
Okay.
Or something like that from PBS. It came out a few years ago.
Okay.
But that is the most intense war documentary I've ever heard of, and I never really heard. No one reads or
teaches. Is it about the Korean War?
It's about the Korean War, and it's sort of that moment that there's when you have like the waves of Chinese troops coming over.
I see.
Yeah. And there's just this. Basically everyone's stretched too thin.
I see.
And so you're literally in this situation where, quote, the enemy is in front of you, behind you, everywhere, and it's way below freezing.
I see.
Yeah. So the good thing is if you had really bad injuries, it froze, and so people actually didn't bleed to death.
Oh, interesting.
Because it froze and it stopped. It's just a completely surreal.
Yeah.
And there's they have film footage too. Sure. So there's a mixture of sort of photography and film.
Okay. Wow.
But that has to be one of the most intense.
Chosen Reservoir.
Yeah, Chosen Reservoir. The War of Chosen Reservoir. Something like that. It's PBS Chosen Reservoir document. You could type that in, and it's probably on YouTube. But if anything, you can go through our campus.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Anyway.
This reminds me of the guy that wrote the Short Timers, Gustav Hasford, who was I think he was a Marine during Vietnam, and then the Short Timers is what got turned into Full Metal Jacket. That he worked with Kubrick to turn into Full Metal Jacket. But in particular, I just remember there's a passage in the Short Timers where they're talking about interacting with some South Korean Marines, Blue Dragons, and the phrase they said, which is incredible, is these guys are so hard they got muscles in their shit. I was like, that's incredible. That's an amazing way to try to describe this, and perfect for the book and the kind of tenor of the book.
That's an attribute.
That's right.
That'd be something to brag about.
That's right.
You would stop conversations.
Yeah.
What else here? So, I mean, Jesse James. They eventually get caught. Everyone gets caught, it seems.
Yep.
You never really get, even Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kids.
Yeah.
Kid gets.
Only ends a couple ways, right?
Yeah. What else? I mean, there was, a chapter on the Wild Bunch, the actual Wild Bunch.
Yeah.
Which, it's another classic Western from 1969. It's arguably you could say the turn to sort of a new cinema that starts with Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate, 1967. There's this shift in Hollywood, and that's where all these young directors step in, and that gives us sort of the Jaws, Close Encounters, Taxi Driver.
I see. Okay.
Right. The Godfather, like it's all Chinatown.
Okay.
All these movies that sort of mark the 70s. The Wild Bunch is the Western that really, and then there's the famous last scene where it's super bloody. From our eyes, it's not. You're kind of like,
at the time, though.
But at the time, like John Wayne did not like it because it was too violent.
Okay, too much gore.
Yeah, it was too violent. But the end is, I mean, it's basically it's arguably very much a model for the game because it's around the same time.
Yeah.
They're a lot older.
Okay.
And they're just trying to do the last score to get out and like basically retire.
I see. So that's very much along the lines of the game.
Yeah. And there's sort of this tiredness to it as you watch, right? Like you're weary for these characters because
Sure.
you know what's coming.
Yeah.
Right? It's like there's no good that's going to come out of this. No one is on their game.
Yeah.
You know, it's not going to end happy. But that kind of, that's sort of, that gets us through this week's readings. I mean, there wasn't too much to get through, and that opens us up to part 2 of the book for next week.
That's right.
But just keep reading, let's see, week 13 next week. So we're steadily moving towards the end.
We're close to the semester being done. That's right. So, well, thank you for joining us all today. And as we said earlier, if you have any questions about any course content or your paper or anything, please shoot an email to us, and we'll be happy to talk with you. Otherwise, have a great day.